I was 26 when they sent my team into the lower vault wing of Fort Knox. It was a cold night in early autumn, the kind that presses against the skin before rain. Our orders were simple on paper. Check a string of silent sensors. Confirm the vault seals, report back. Nothing more. Yet the moment we stepped past the last man post, I felt the air change. It tasted faintly metallic, like old coins left in the mouth. The corridor lights buzzed in uneven rows. Some flickered, some stayed dark. Our boots scraped across floors older than the main vault, floors that carried a thin layer of dust even though this area was supposed to stay sealed. A cold patch drifted across my hands as I checked my gear, sharp enough to sting the knuckles. We kept going, one slow step at a time, toward a wing. The map showed, but no one claimed to know. Before we start the video, hit the subscribe button to support the channel. I arrived at Fort Knox in the middle of a gray morning. The sky was low, the kind that makes the whole post feel quiet even when trucks roll past the barracks. I had been with the security detachment for 3 years by then. We covered tasks that never made the official boards, small teams, short notice, limited questions. Most days it meant long watches and equipment checks. Once in a while, it meant something stranger. My team leader, a steady man named Ortiz, met me outside the admin building. He stood with a folder tucked under his arm, the thin kind used for classified notes. He handed it to me without a word and started walking toward the motor pool. I opened it as I followed him. The instructions were short. A string of sensors in a lower storage area had gone silent 3 nights in a row. Maintenance had already checked the wiring and found no problem. The command wanted a human look. The note at the bottom held my attention. It said the wing had not been used in many years. No explanation. No reason. Just a line reminding us to keep full logs. I had seen enough odd tasks to know that meant little. Logs often went into boxes that were locked away before sunrise. When we reached the motor pool, the rest of the team waited with gear stacked beside a small transport truck. 4 soldiers, all quiet, all familiar. Each of us carried our usual load. I kept my pack light. Extra batteries, a field recorder, water, and a coil of cord. I had a habit of marking distances when maps felt off, and this mission had that kind of feeling from the start. The ride toward the old access point took less than 15 minutes. Most of the route passed through parts of the post tourists never saw. There were storage sheds, old bunkers filled with training gear, and a set of rail spurs that had not seen a working car since my parents were young. Everything looked forgotten, but still guarded. That was typical for this place. We reached the checkpoint for the lower wing. The guard on duty checked our badges and looked over our orders longer than he needed to. After a slow breath, he waved us through. He told us the wing felt colder than usual. I asked if he meant the temperature. He shook his head. He said it felt wrong, like the air stayed still even when the vents ran. He stopped talking after that. Some guards share small warnings when they think no one will write them down. I kept his words in my mind. Past the checkpoint, the truck rolled down a narrow lane that ended near a concrete stairwell. The stairwell had no sign, just a faded number plate bolted crooked near the top. Snowmelt had streaked dark lines across the walls. We stepped out and geared up. The cold touched my throat with that faint metallic taste again, same as during the hook of our night entry, and I wondered how long that sensation had been there without my noticing. The others felt it too. No one mentioned it. Inside the stairwell, the air changed again. My skin prickled along the forearms. The temperature dropped as we descended. It was not a steady drop. It came in waves, pockets of sharp cold that faded a few steps later. I counted the landings. There were more than expected. The map in my folder showed 3 levels. We passed what felt like 5 before reaching the main corridor. The corridor lights glowed a dull yellow. Some hummed. Some flickered in slow pulses. The walls were older than most of the post, built in a time when concrete was poured in rough slabs. A thin line of dust traced the edges where wall met floor. That dust caught my eye. I saw faint curves in it, gentle arcs that looked as if someone had dragged a smooth object across the ground. The marks had no clear start or end. They simply curled and vanished. Ortiz told us to fan out along the first stretch and check the mounted sensors. I moved to the right wall, counting steps. Every 20 steps, I clicked my recorder to mark position. My breath felt heavy in that place, not from effort, but from a sense that the air wanted to move away from me. I kept tasting metal. It did not fade. The first sensor looked fine. No corrosion, no loose wires. I logged it and moved to the next. The lights dimmed for a brief moment as I reached it, just long enough to feel the darkness press near. When they brightened again, one of my teammates stood still ahead of me, staring down the far corridor. I asked if he saw something. He only said the dust looked different each time he blinked. We spread deeper into the wing. The floor sloped slightly, something the map did not show. The slope forced us to lean forward without meaning to. Another cold patch touched my neck, thin as a passing breath. I turned to check the air vent beside me. No air moved through it. Farther down, we reached a side door marked as sealed on the folder map, yet it stood cracked open by the width of a finger. No one wanted to be the first to touch it. I remember thinking the gap looked too even, as if something had opened it slowly and with care. Ortiz signaled for us to leave it for the return pass. We kept going. As we neared the deeper turns, the corridor grew wider. The lights thinned out. Shadows took longer shapes. I checked my recorder and saw the timestamps drift slightly. Only a few seconds, but enough to make me pause. That metallic taste stayed in the back of my throat. Every breath made it sharper. By the time we reached the next junction, each of us felt the same thing. The place was not empty. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Yet the air carried a pressure that pushed lightly against our shoulders, as if something watched from just beyond the dim light. We stepped forward because we had to, and the corridor seemed to stretch ahead in a way I could not explain. The junction opened into a wider hall lined with storage doors that had been painted long before I joined the service. The colors had faded to dull shades, and each door carried a number that looked hand-stamped rather than stenciled. I ran my fingers along one of them. The metal felt colder than the surrounding air, as if it held a chill from someplace deeper. A small ring of frost clung to the lower edge. I wiped it with my glove and watched it melt into a thin streak. Ortiz ordered us to split into pairs. I went with Hayes, a steady soldier who rarely spoke unless needed. We moved down the left side of the hall while the others worked the right. The dust along the floor thinned as we advanced, almost as if our steps pushed it back. Yet when I glanced behind us, the footprints seemed softer than they should, edges already fading. The air felt dry, almost hollow, and each breath made that metallic taste cling to the back of my teeth. We checked each storage door. Most were locked, but a few hung slightly loose, as if the aging hinges had begun to give way. Behind one door, I saw only empty shelves and a single overturned crate. Behind another, old cables lay coiled in a corner. Nothing explained the dead sensors from the upper boards. Nothing explained the frost rings. When we reached the end of the row, Hayes pointed toward a narrow turn on the map that should have led to an old service office. Instead, the corridor sloped downward again. The map showed no slope. I stepped forward and felt the change at once. The concrete under my boots had a faint vibration, almost too soft to notice. It pulsed once, paused, then pulsed again. I crouched and placed my hand on the floor. The vibration faded. When I stood, it returned. We called the others over. Ortiz listened with his own hand on the ground. He told us to move deeper, but keep our spacing tight. None of us argued. The corridor walls here looked different. The original concrete had been replaced with smoother panels, dull metal sheets bolted in uneven rows. The bolts were not rusted, they looked polished. Something about their shine made me uneasy, like they had been cleaned recently even though this wing was supposed to be untouched. Farther down, the temperature dropped again. This time the cold came stronger, building in small bursts that made my breath turn thin. My arms felt tight inside my uniform, and a line of tension wrapped across my shoulders. Hayes kept glancing behind us. When I asked him what he saw, he said the dust at our backs looked like it shifted. I turned to check. The floor showed faint arcs again, small curves etched in the thin layer of dust. They had not been there when we passed. We reached another door. This one had no number, no pane, no lock. It sat flush with the wall, almost invisible until we stood close. A hairline gap traced its edges. The cold drifted strongest here. I leaned in to listen, expecting silence, but the air behind that door carried a faint low tone, like distant wind moving through a narrow space. It rose for a moment, held steady, then slipped away. Ortiz marked the position on his notepad. He did not try to open it. We pulled back and moved toward the next junction. The lights above us dimmed again. This time, they took longer to recover. During the dimming, the end of the corridor seemed farther away. When the lights brightened, the distance returned to what it had been. Hayes and I exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Strange things happen underground, especially in older structures, but this felt different. It felt intentional. Near the next corner, we found a small alcove cut into the wall. It held an old electrical cabinet, its door half open. Inside, the wires hung neatly, no signs of damage, no loose ends. Yet the metal tray beneath the switches held a thin film of dust shaped into long, soft curves. The shapes reminded me of the arcs in the hallway. They looked as if something smooth had traced slow circles in the dust with patience. I stepped back from the cabinet and checked our map again. According to the printed layout, the next few turns should have brought us to the lower vault access gate. Instead, the corridor ahead sloped deeper, widening at the sides. The lights grew fewer. Shadows leaned along the walls. My recorder clicked every 20 steps, but when I checked the timestamps, they no longer lined up evenly. A gap of several seconds appeared between clicks, even though I kept my pace steady. The others felt it too. A pressure in the air, almost like being watched from a corner you could not see. Not threatening at first, just aware. I tried to steady my breathing. I had been in tight spaces before. Mines, cold storage tunnels, old bunkers used in training. None of those felt like this. The air here seemed to follow us, shifting around our shoulders and sliding along our backs like it was learning our presence. We reached a wider chamber that opened with no warning. The ceiling rose higher than the corridor, forming a hollow space filled with stale air. No equipment, no supplies. Only bare walls and a floor coated with thin dust. In the center lay a small patch where the dust had been disturbed, not brushed aside, but parted in slow arcs. 3 arcs, each almost the length of my hand, curling like crescents. I crouched and traced one with my glove. The shape felt too smooth for a boot, too even for a drag tool. A cold patch drifted over my shoulder again. It lingered longer this time. I held still, waiting for it to pass. My breath felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I stood and checked the team. Their faces told me they felt the same weight. Ortiz ordered us to hold position and regroup. We tightened our formation near the wall, listening to the empty chamber. The low tone I had heard earlier returned, faint and steady. It came from somewhere beyond the far side of the room, somewhere the map showed as unfinished or sealed. We had not reached the main problem yet. We all sensed that. This was only the threshold of something deeper inside the wing, something that had waited there long before our orders were written. We left the wide chamber and moved into the deeper corridor that stretched beyond it. The air felt different as soon as we crossed the threshold. It pressed against our chest, gentle at first, then firmer, as if the space wanted to measure us. My breathing grew slow out of caution, not fear, though both sat close together inside me. The metallic taste sharpened again. I tried to swallow it down, but it stayed. The floor here changed texture. The concrete went smoother, almost polished in places, as if something had passed over it many times. No marks of machinery, no scrapes from equipment. Just a clean, dull shine that did not match the age of the wing. Our boots left faint prints, yet even those softened around the edges sooner than they should have. The dust behaved strangely, gathering in thin curves along the walls rather than lying flat. Ortiz called for tighter spacing. We formed a narrow line and pressed on. The corridor lights grew more spaced out. Long stretches fell into a dim gray where our lamps carried most of the weight. Each lamp beam seemed thinner than usual, as if the air swallowed some of the light before it could reach the walls. Shadows stretched where they should not. Sometimes they flickered, not because of our movement, but because of something deeper in the dark. We passed another door that had no number. The surface looked newer than the rest. Smooth metal, no handle, no hinges. Only a thin outline giving away its shape. The cold radiated from it strong enough to bite my palms through my gloves. I leaned in slightly. The metal hummed with the faint tone we kept hearing, a sound that drifted just above silence. Ortiz marked the door's position and moved us on. No one touched it. Past that point, the corridor split. Our map showed only a straight line. Yet 2 new routes opened to the left and right. Both sloped downward. The center passage led level for a while before turning sharply out of sight. Ortiz studied the map, then the walls, then the floor. None of it matched. He chose the level path, saying it was closest to the supposed vault access. We followed, though none of us trusted the ground by then. The farther we walked, the stronger that strange low tone became. It never rose loud, but it grew steady. The kind of sound that settles into your bones before it reaches your ears. Every few steps, a cold patch brushed across one of us, sometimes only for a second, sometimes longer. It never stayed in one place. It drifted like breath, moving through the corridors. Hayes walked beside me. He kept glancing at the walls as if expecting them to shift. When I asked him what he felt, he said the distances seemed wrong. He pointed to a door ahead and said it looked close, But when we reached it, the door felt farther than he had judged. I had noticed the same thing but had not said it aloud. The corridors behaved like they stretched or tightened around our movement. I checked my recorder again. The timestamps drifted even more. We came to a bend where the light failed completely. Only our lamps lit the passage. The darkness felt heavy, thicker than any I had seen underground. I raised my lamp and saw the beam fade too fast, as if some of the space ahead refused to reflect it. Dust on the floor showed new shapes. Not arcs, this time. Narrow lines, nearly straight, running along the center of the path. They reminded me of something being dragged, slow and steady. The lines ended at the bend as if whatever made them had turned the corner. Ortiz signaled for silence. We stood still, listening. Nothing moved, no echo, no drip of water. Only that faint low tone, rising and falling like slow breathing. A cold patch slid across my back, crawling up to the base of my neck. It lingered until I stepped forward, pushing myself to break that stillness. We rounded the bend. The corridor there opened into a long hall. On each side stood metal support frames, maybe from an old construction project. Some had loose wires curling from them. Others were bare. The floor dipped in the middle, forming a shallow basin. Dust covered most of it except for a path through the center where the dust seemed swept in soft waves. I crouched and touched the floor. It felt warm in one narrow line, as if something had passed only moments before. As we advanced through the hall, I noticed small flecks across the ground, tiny pieces of tarnished metal. They looked like shavings scraped from old plates. When I brushed a bit between my fingers, it left a faint smell that mixed with a metallic taste in my throat, almost like old copper. Near the far end stood a larger structure, a tall metal panel wedged into the wall. It had a faint dent at the center, as if something had pressed from the other side. The dent curved inward, too smooth for a tool strike, too even for an accident. I placed my gloved hand on it. The metal felt warm in the center and cold along the edges. That uneven temperature unsettled me more than anything else we had seen. Ortiz told us to check for any secondary access routes. We spread out carefully. I moved to the right wall and found a small recess barely wide enough for one person. It held an old maintenance crate with its lid missing. Inside lay a handful of rusted fasteners and a thin strip of metal bent into a crescent. The curve matched the shapes we had seen earlier in the dust. I held the strip up to my lamp. Its edges looked polished, not worn. Something had shaped it with purpose. I felt a cold patch drift against my wrist as I lowered it back into the crate. When I stepped out of the recess, Hayes called softly for us. He pointed to a section of wall where faint marks crossed the dust. They were not footprints. They looked like impressions of something round, smooth, and spaced apart with strange rhythm. A chill settled in my stomach. The marks led toward another corridor that the map claimed did not exist. We gathered near that path. The air felt different there. The pressure shifted as if something breathed deeper in that direction. Ortiz hesitated before ordering us forward. We followed him because that was our job, even as every step made the metal taste grow sharper. The new corridor stretched downward at a slow angle. The walls grew smoother, almost perfect in some places. The lights above barely held. Our lamps filled the gaps, but the shadows moved in ways I could not trust. The dust on the floor looked swept into fresh arcs that had not been there moments earlier. I watched one arc carefully. Its edge seemed softer each time I blinked, as if it tried to settle into a new shape. The corridor ended at a door like the earlier strange ones. Smooth, seamless, cold enough to sting through gloves. The faint tone vibrated from behind it. Not loud, just steady. A slow heartbeat of air. We stood there, gathered close, knowing we had reached something the reports never mentioned. Ortiz stood in front of the seamless door, studying it without speaking. None of us wanted to touch it. The cold coming off the metal felt sharper than the air around us. It gathered in thin layers, brushing our gloves and drifting across our wrists like slow-moving frost. The faint, low tone behind the door kept a steady rhythm, rising only when someone shifted their weight. Each time it rose, the cold deepened. After a long moment, Ortiz told us to mark the position and move on. We needed to find the source of the sensor failures, not force our way into a place we were not cleared to enter. We stepped back, keeping our lights steady on the walls. As we turned, I felt the cold ease from my hands. It moved away, sliding across the floor toward the far corners of the corridor like it had its own path. We retraced part of the hall and followed a narrow branch that sloped even deeper. The map in my folder had become useless by then. None of the turns matched. The printed lines felt like they belonged to a different structure. Maybe one that once existed but no longer held its shape. I kept the folder closed and counted steps instead, clicking my recorder every 20 steps the way I always did. When I checked the timestamps between clicks, the gaps grew wider, almost double. The branch corridor opened into a long chamber with a row of support beams along one side. Each beam was wrapped at the base with thin metal strips. Some coils looked new, others were worn to dull gray. The strips caught reflections from our lamps in odd angles, bending the light so it shimmered along the edges. The metallic smell in the air thickened. It clung to the back of my throat, mixing with the cold that drifted unevenly through the room. Ace pointed to the floor beneath one of the beams. The dust there held fresh arcs again, this time overlapping. Their curves formed shapes I could not match to anything I knew. They looked patient, slow, almost deliberate. The arcs pointed toward a narrow service crawl on the far side of the chamber, a small rectangular opening framed by chipped concrete. The crawl space was not mentioned in our orders. It was not on the map. Ortiz sent 2 soldiers to check it from the entrance only, no entry. They crouched low, shining lamps inside. Their lights hit a patch of metal similar to the strips wrapped around the beams. The metal glowed faintly under the lamp beams, as if reacting to the light. One soldier said the surface looked rippled, not flat. The other said he saw small indentations, like rounded impressions pressed into the metal. Before they could study it longer, a cold drift pushed out of the crawl space, strong enough to frost the lower edges of their lamps. They stepped back right away. We pulled away from the crawl and moved toward the next corridor. This one narrowed so much that we had to pass single file. The walls felt too close. Their surfaces were smoother than natural concrete, almost polished. Every scrape of a glove left no mark. The faint tone returned here, steady and low. It echoed somewhere inside the walls, never quite leaving the corridor, never quite staying behind us. About halfway through the narrow stretch, I saw something ahead. A shape, faint and low to the ground like someone crouched near the floor. I whispered to Ortiz. We raised our lamps. The shape did not move. When we stepped closer, the shape shifted into a pile of gear. A pack. A helmet. A canteen. Standard issue. All placed neatly on the floor. The helmet had a hairline scratch on the front. The canteen held a dent near the cap. The pack straps were buckled tight. I knew these items. They belonged to one of our team who had walked ahead on the right flank earlier, but he was not here now. The chamber stretched empty around us. Dust on the floor had no footprints leading toward the pack or away from it. Ortiz called the missing soldier's name. No answer came. The faint tone behind the walls rose slightly and held steady, almost as if listening. A cold patch drifted over our boots, thin and sharp like breath pulled across the ground. I stepped back from the pack, feeling an unease settle into my spine. The dust around the gear had shifted into soft arcs again, as if something had circled it slowly. Hayes checked the walls for openings. He found nothing. The corridor behind us showed only our own fading prints. The one ahead held the same faint arcs we had seen in earlier sections. They curled toward a deeper turn, drawing us forward whether we wanted to go or not. We moved on because staying still felt worse. Each step made the air heavier. The corridor walls seemed to tilt slightly, though when I blinked, they looked level. Shadows crept along the edges of our lamps. Some shadows stretched longer than our bodies. Some bent at quiet angles. We reached the deeper turn and found another wide hall. This one held old construction frames stacked against the far wall. The metal frames leaned in strange patterns, forming tall shapes with empty centers. The dust beneath them swirled into long, curved paths. I thought the arcs here looked freshest of all. They overlapped tightly, like many slow passes had been made again and again. The hall ended at a second seamless door, shaped like the first but larger. The cold around it pulsed stronger, rising in short bursts as we approached. The low tone vibrated through the metal. I felt it through my boots even before touching the floor. Ortiz signaled us to form a tight circle near the door. We checked our gear, we checked our lamps. We checked the corridor behind us, where the dust had shifted again since our arrival. Our missing teammate remained unaccounted for. The air felt uneasy in that hall, as if the space itself expected something next. Ortiz looked at each of us, then at the door. He decided we would not force it. We needed to pull back and find a path that matched the recorded structure. We turned to leave. But the corridor behind us felt changed. The shadows leaned closer. The cold drifted across our backs in a slow wave. The dust along the floor no longer showed clear arcs. It formed a long, sweeping shape that pointed deeper into the hall, toward the seamless door we had rejected. I clicked my recorder again. The timestamp came late by several seconds, even though I clicked it on the beat of my steps. My heartbeat pushed hard in my ears. I felt the metallic taste coat my mouth so thick it almost numbed my tongue. We moved back into the corridor, staying slow and steady. But the pressure in the air kept building, like something shifted behind the walls and gave weight to the space around us. The deeper turns ahead looked different than when we arrived. Shadows clung to the corners. The cold crawled up the walls with each step we took. We had not reached the source yet. The wing had more to show us, and it was already changing around our movement. We moved through the corridor with slow steps, trying to return to a point on the map that still made sense. The air changed again. It grew lighter for a moment, then tightened around us as if the walls pulled closer. My boots felt heavier against the smooth floor. I counted my breaths to calm myself, but each breath carried that metallic taste that had followed us since the first turn. We reached a crossway that looked familiar at first glance. Same spacing, same lights, same support beams. But when I checked the marks we had left earlier, nothing matched. The dust showed no trace of our prints. Only soft arcs pressed into the thin layer, arranged in slow curves that crossed one another. Some arcs were long, some were short. All of them pointed toward a narrow door at the far wall. A door that had not been there before. No hinges, no handle, no markings. Just a perfect outline cut into the concrete. Ortiz hesitated. I could see his mind working through every role we had trained on. No team enters an unlisted space without cause. No team trusts a structural change without a clear source. Yet our path back had vanished. The corridor behind us looked the same, but the distance felt wrong. Shadows along the walls bent at strange angles. The lights above hummed in uneven rhythm. I could not tell if the hallway had lengthened or if our sense of it had shifted. The faint low tone returned, not from the walls this time, from behind the new door. We closed ranks and crossed the hall. Each step made the tone rise slightly, almost like it responded to our movement. When we reached the door, the cold drifted out in slow pulses. It wrapped around our arms, slid across our chests, and spread behind our knees. I felt a small shiver climb my back. Hayes gripped his lamp tighter. Another soldier stepped away from the wall as if something brushed against him. Ortiz raised his hand. No one touched the door. He marked the time, then stepped to the side to test the frame with the tip of his glove. The moment he touched the edge, the door released a short breath of air. Not warm, not cold, just hollow, like air that had been trapped for many years and did not belong to the place around it. The door eased open by the width of one finger. A narrow gap formed, revealing only darkness inside. Our lamp shined against it but did not reach far. The darkness felt thicker than anything we had seen earlier, like it swallowed the light on contact. I took a small breath and tried to sense the space ahead. The air inside smelled old, holding the same metallic hint, but mixed with something faintly earthy, almost like turned soil. We had no choice. Our path back had become uncertain. The corridor we stood in kept shifting in ways none of us could track. We needed a stable point, a landmark, anything that held its place in this wing. Ortiz told us to enter slowly. We stepped into the dark space one by one. The floor felt different at once. Not concrete, not polished. It had a subtle texture, like metal sheets laid in overlapping rows. My boots gave off a faint, dull ring each time I shifted my weight. The walls carried the same texture, smooth at first touch, slightly warm in narrow bands, cold in others. When our lights adjusted, the room revealed itself. It was a long, unfinished vault, larger than any listed for that sector. The walls held tarnished metal plates fixed in uneven patterns. Some plates bulged outward, others bent inward. Thin seams of frost traced their edges. The ceiling rose high, but shadows hid most of it. The faint low tone we had heard from the corridor vibrated strongest here, running through the plates, humming through the floor, spreading through our boots. Near the center of the vault lay gear, neatly set. Our missing teammate's gear, his pack, his helmet, his gloves, his folded jacket, all arranged with care, placed in a tidy row like someone had laid them out for inspection. No dust settled on them yet. The dust around the gear showed a wide circular mark, a slow sweeping arc that formed almost a perfect crescent. We spread out in a tight half circle. I checked behind the plates for openings. None. I checked the floor for prints. None. I checked the ceiling for ducts. None. Then the lights from our lamps stretched across the room in long, narrow shadows, bending into shapes that did not match our bodies. One shadow lengthened across the far wall. Its arm hung lower than a human arm, its head tilted at a slight angle. The shape stood still. When I turned my lamp to check the source, the shadow slid back into the normal pattern. I looked at Hayes. He had seen it too. The low tone rose once more, steady as a slow breath. We had reached something the reports never mentioned, something the structure itself seemed built around. And the vault beneath Fort Knox did not feel empty. It felt aware. Ortiz signaled for us to spread out across the vault, slow and steady, keeping our lamps aimed toward the plates on the walls. The light bent again in small ways, curving around edges that should have reflected it cleanly. I kept my beam tight and low, following the faint curves in the dust that circled the missing soldier's gear. The arcs thinned toward the far corner of the vault, forming a wide path where the dust had been brushed aside in soft waves. I followed the path with careful steps. The air thickened around me, not colder or warmer, just denser, as if each breath had to push its way through a narrow gap. The metallic taste stretched across my tongue and settled in the back of my throat. My skin prickled along the arms again. A slow pulse ran through the floor beneath my boots, so soft I barely felt it. But it was there. Hayes crouched near a section where a plate bent inward. He lifted his lamp and pointed to small indentations along the curve. They looked like rounded impressions spaced unevenly, almost like something had pressed against the metal over and over. The pattern did not match tools or machinery I knew. The inner edges of the impressions were clean and smooth, not dented by force but shaped with slow pressure. I moved closer to examine the plate. When I placed my gloved hand near one indentation, the metal warmed slightly. Not across the whole surface, only where the curve dipped inward, as if something behind the wall held heat in that exact spot. I pulled my hand back at once. The warmth felt alive in a way metal should not. Ortiz checked his watch. His face tightened. He showed the time to me. We had been in the vault for only a few minutes by my count, yet the watch showed nearly half an hour had passed. My recorder matched Ortiz's watch, not my sense of time. The clicks that marked each 20 steps had spaced themselves far apart. My legs did not feel tired enough for that time to be real. None of us looked winded. None of us felt sweat under our gear. Something had shifted our sense of time inside the corridors. Now it was stronger here. Near the far wall, one of the soldiers called softly. He pointed to a thin fissure running between two large plates. It stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The gap was no wider than a coin, yet cold air drifted through it in steady pulses, each pulse followed by a faint rise in the low tone. The fissure's edges glimmered under our lamps, as if coated with a thin film of polished metal dust. I leaned close without touching. Through the narrow gap, I saw only darkness, but not flat darkness. It felt layered, like depth existed just beyond the visible edge. The cold from the fissure slid across my cheek in a thin line. I stepped back slowly, keeping my breath steady. Then something shifted. Not in the room, not behind the walls, inside the dust on the floor. The arcs changed. Their curves tightened. The lines that once formed slow sweeps now bent toward the center of the vault. A few grains slid across the metal floor in such a gentle motion, I almost doubted what I saw. But Hayes whispered that he saw it too. Dust should not move on still ground. Yet the small arcs drew themselves into narrower shapes. I checked the ceiling. Nothing moved above us. The shadows near the plates stretched again in odd angles. One shadow broke from its normal line for a moment and seemed to lean forward. When I raised my lamp, the shadow snapped back into place. Ortiz ordered us to regroup near the entrance. He kept his voice steady, but I heard the tight edge beneath it. We moved with deliberate steps, each of us watching the plates and the shifting arcs in the dust. The low tone deepened slightly. Not loud, just thick enough to rest in the bones. When we reached the entrance, the corridor outside did not look the same as when we entered. The walls angled inward as if the corridor had tightened. The lights flickered in a slow rhythm. The cold moved in thin streams along the floor. Our prints from earlier had faded into loose curls, erased by new arcs that pointed away from the vault. Ortiz checked the map again, his thumb pressed hard against the corner, as if trying to anchor himself to something fixed. The layout made no sense anymore. Turns we had taken were missing. Halls that should be ahead were gone. The structure around us behaved like it shifted to its own quiet pattern, responding to our movement, changing paths the moment we tried to retrace them. We stepped into the corridor because staying in the vault felt worse. The air there pressed against our backs, urging us to leave. Yet the corridor carried its own weight. The dust ahead showed a straight line leading deeper into the wing. A thin, clean line, as if something smooth had moved along it without lifting. No footprints, no arcs, just that one line. As we followed it, the lights dimmed again. Shadows along the floor seemed to move in slow beats, matching the low tone inside the walls. My breath tightened in my chest. I kept glancing back, expecting the vault door to shift or close on its own. Instead, the shadows near it stretched thin like long fingers reaching toward the corridor, before breaking apart into normal shapes again. We turned another bend. Another missing corridor. Another hallway we did not know we had taken. The wing was folding around us, not collapsing. Folding. Quiet. Controlled. Patient. The dust on the ground swirled into new arcs as we passed. The cold patches drifted closer and closer, brushing our ankles, sliding past our knees, curling around our hands. We had crossed a point in the wing where the structure no longer followed human plans. And something inside those shifting halls now knew exactly where we were. The corridor tightened around us as we pushed deeper into the shifting wing. Each step brought a new change. A wall leaned in where it had not before. A light flickered out and did not return. The dust at our feet drew itself into narrow paths that pointed forward, as if guiding us or pushing us. I watched those paths with unease. They curved with slow intent, always drifting ahead of our boots. Ortiz tried again to raise command on the radio. Only static answered. Not sharp static. Soft. Slow. Almost like breath passing through dry leaves. He checked the settings twice, then lowered the handset with a look I had never seen on him. Not fear, not confusion. A quiet acceptance that whatever lived in this place did not want our words reaching anyone above. We chose the only direction left to us. The air in the corridor pressed on our shoulders, guiding our pace. I counted steps again, not trusting my sense of distance. I clicked my recorder at each 20th step, but the sound came back delayed, echoing faintly through the hall as if recorded somewhere inside the structure and then returned to us a moment later. Far ahead, the corridor opened into a wide room, dimly lit by a handful of weak bulbs. Shadows leaned inward from all sides. As we entered, the cold gathered behind us in a steady line, blocking the way we came. The dust on the ground shifted into sweeping arcs that fanned out like quiet warnings. I felt a pulse run beneath the floor, soft but steady. The room held remnants of construction frames like earlier chambers, but these stood arranged in a tall ring. Each frame curved inward at the top, forming a hollow circle at the center. Tarnished metal shavings littered the ground beneath them. When I crouched and touched a few, they crumbled into fine powder. The powder clung to my glove, with that same faint metallic smell that had followed us from the first corridor. Ortiz stepped into the ring with his lamp raised. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the air inside the circle moved. Not wind, not ventilation. It shifted in one slow ripple, like a breath taken by something too large to see. The low tone that followed us through the walls rose from the ring's center. It vibrated so softly the lamps trembled in our hands. A soldier behind me said he saw movement near the far wall. I swung my lamp toward the spot. Spilled dust glimmered there, shaped into thin crescents. 3 crescents overlapped in a pattern I had not seen before. Their edges were clean, as if made by something smooth and round, pressing gently into the floor. When I leaned closer, I saw the dust in those crescents tremble. It slid inward by a fraction, forming a sharper arc. I stepped back at once, then the lights flickered. In that brief dimming, a shape appeared near the wall, a human outline. But slightly bent, the limbs angled in soft curves that did not match natural joints. When the light steadied, the shape disappeared. Hayes whispered my name. He stood beside the tall ring, pointing at the floor. Fresh arcs formed in the dust at his feet. They grew in slow motion, curling one grain at a time into a careful crescent. His boots had not moved, no wind touched the ground. The arcs formed by themselves, as if something unseen traced them with gentle precision. Ortiz ordered us to pull back, staying close. We regrouped near the room's entrance. The cold pressed in behind us again, stronger now, forming a thin wall of air that held us inside. The dust across the ground stirred in soft waves. New lines appeared, long and narrow, stretching toward the deeper door on the far side of the room. A door we had not noticed earlier. It stood tall and seamless, similar to the other strange doors but darker, almost absorbing the lamp beams instead of reflecting them. The faint tone rose from behind it in a steady rhythm. I felt the vibration through the floor, up my legs, into my chest. It pushed my heartbeat into a slow, heavy rhythm that did not match my own. Ortiz stepped toward the door. The air thickened with each of his steps. I followed close behind him, the others forming a tight line. As we drew near, the door's surface shifted. Not visibly at first, but in the way it felt. My lamp beam met resistance, as if the air in front of the door held a thin membrane. The dust reached the base of the door and formed a perfect arc. Then the door opened, only a few inches. Enough for cold air to spill out in a slow, steady band, sliding across our boots and rising up our legs. Enough for the low tone to deepen into something that felt like a distant breath. Enough for every lamp to dim as if drawn toward the darkness inside. Ortiz lifted his hand to signal a halt. But before he could speak, the radio at his shoulder crackled, and we heard his own voice, not from him, from deep inside the open door, repeating words he had spoken earlier in the mission, soft, hollow, delayed. It felt like the wing had been recording us. Listening, waiting. The door eased open a hair wider, and the cold deepened. The cold deepened until it wrapped around our knees like a rising tide. I kept my lamp steady on the widening gap, though the light looked thin and weak against the darkness inside. The low tone pulsed through the floor again. Each pulse felt slower than the one before it, as if the whole wing breathed in long measured cycles. Ortiz stepped back from the door, eyes fixed on the radio. The voice coming from inside repeated his earlier words, the exact ones he had spoken when we reached the lower turns. Hearing his voice echo back from a place we had never entered made the room feel narrower than it already was. The others shifted closer, forming a tight cluster. None of us wanted to stand near the open gap. The dust near the door stirred. It gathered into long, thin lines, bending toward the darkness. The lines curled into loops that tightened as if being drawn by an unseen hand. I watched one line stretch toward the threshold and fade as it crossed into the dark. Another followed, then another. The dust grains moved with purpose, drifting like metal shavings pulled toward a magnet. Ortiz told us we were leaving. His voice stayed steady, but his hands trembled when he pointed us toward the exit. We turned to retreat, moving quickly but not running. None of us wanted to see what waited behind the door if it opened any wider. I clicked my recorder one more time, letting the sound mark the moment we stepped away. The click echoed faintly ahead of us, not behind. It felt as if the wing returned the sound along a different path. The corridor outside the chamber had shifted again. The walls narrowed, tilting at slight angles. Lights blinked in long, slow pulses. Shadows stretched across our boots. Each time our lamps passed a shadow, it slid a fraction farther than where it belonged. The cold followed us, drifting behind like a quiet tide, touching our backs with thin waves of chill. We moved fast through the turns, following whatever path seemed open. The dust guided us in strange ways. Some areas cleared themselves into thin channels ahead of our steps, others filled with soft arcs as soon as we crossed them. I kept watching for the gear of our missing teammate, hoping to spot any trace of him. The thought of leaving him in the shifting halls hollowed my chest, but we had no sign of him, no sound, no movement. Near one stretch of corridor, Hayes stumbled. His breath turned shallow. His legs shook. I reached out to steady him and felt the cold run through his jacket into my arm. He whispered that he saw something behind us. He said a shape stood at the edge of the hall, a bent outline that followed without sound. I turned with my lamp raised. Only the long shadows stared back, shifting softly along the floor. But the look in Hayes' eyes told me he had seen more than shadows. We had to move faster. I lifted him by the shoulder and kept him close. Ortiz cleared the path ahead, checking each turn. Another soldier covered our rear, though we kept glancing back more often than usual. The walls hummed in uneven patterns. The low tone deepened each time we stepped into a corridor that seemed new. I no longer trusted any distance we walked. The hallways extended and tightened at will, responding to our movement like a living maze. At one bend, the floor vibrated through my boots. A moment later, the lights above flickered out. Only our lamps remained. The shadows near the walls leaned inward as if reaching toward us. I heard Hayes take a slow breath. He whispered that something crouched at the far end of the hall, waiting. His voice shook. I did not look. I could not risk freezing in place. The lights blinked back on, weak but steady enough to break the moment. The far end of the hall stood empty. Dust patterns across the floor swirled into thin crescents. The air held its cold breath against our ankles. We moved on without speaking. We reached a long slope that looked familiar. I recognized the pattern of metal strips along the walls. This was one of the early corridors, though now it stretched farther and bent at a new angle. Still, it was the closest thing we had to a path back. Ortiz told us to follow the slope up until we hit a junction we recognized. I tightened my grip on Hayes and kept him steady. His breathing had become more even, but his eyes stayed fixed on the corners behind us. Halfway up the slope, the radio crackled again. This time, the voice was not Ortiz. It was the missing soldier. His voice came soft, slow, almost careful. He repeated a single line he had said earlier in the day when he checked his gear. The exact cadence, the exact breath. Hearing it again inside the shifting halls made the air colder at my back. Hayes shivered. The others stopped walking. Ortiz reached for the radio, but the voice faded. The static returned with that same hollow rhythm. We stood in silence for a long moment. Then the dust near our feet shifted. It drew itself into 3 narrow crescents, each pointed up the slope, not down, not sideways, upward. The movement felt deliberate and steady. We followed the crescents. At the top of the slope, a wide passage opened. The walls here looked more like the early sections. Rough concrete, older lights, fewer arcs in the dust. The cold backed away slightly. The air still felt wrong, but less oppressive. I felt hope coil inside my chest for the first time since entering the vault areas. Then we heard the tone again, not behind us. Ahead. It came from a deeper hall we had not planned to enter. The sound rose in a long, slow wave, before fading into a thin hush. Dust lifted in gentle spirals, drifting as if pulled toward the tone. The air pressed close around our legs, guiding us toward the hall even as we tried to move away. Ortiz told us to keep to the original direction, no detours. But the hall ahead tightened, the walls shifted inward. The path we wanted grew thinner than before. Shadows crossed the ground in long, crawling lines. The air felt heavier once more. We broke into a fast walk, then a faster one. The tone rose again, carrying a faint second layer behind it. Not a voice, not an echo. Something like a slow exhale mixed with distant movement. I felt the sound settle behind my ribs. Hayes gripped my arm tighter. He whispered that the shape he saw earlier had followed us all this way and now stood closer than before. I did not look. We pushed forward until the corridor opened suddenly into a small landing. The stairs up to the guard level waited there. I recognized the crooked number plate bolted near the top. The sight of it struck me with a sharp relief that made my knees weak. Ortiz told us to climb fast and not break formation. As we started up, the lights in the stairwell dimmed once more. A cold rush swept through the lower doorway, rising in a long, thin wave that touched the back of my boots and climbed halfway up my legs before fading. I did not turn around. None of us did. We climbed until the cold no longer followed. When we reached the upper landing, the lights steadied. The air cleared. The metallic taste in my mouth thinned, but the quiet inside me knew that something beneath the vault wing still listened, and the wing itself had not finished shifting when we left. It had simply let us go. We reached the guard level in a tight line and stepped into the brighter hallway without speaking. The familiar walls should have brought comfort, but the quiet there felt heavier than anything we had faced underground. My legs trembled as the tension eased, and the cold that had followed us finally slipped away. For a brief moment, I thought the metallic taste would fade too, but it stayed, lighter than before yet fixed at the back of my tongue. A guard waited near the checkpoint desk, confused by our early return. Ortiz handed him the folder with the original orders. The guard looked at the notes, then at our faces, and asked where the missing member of our team was. None of us answered. Ortiz only told him to alert command and request medical staff. His voice sounded flat, as if speaking required more strength than he had left. The guard stepped aside without another question. Some people understand when not to push for details. We moved into a side room marked for short rests. The lights there were steady and warm, but they felt foreign after the shifting corridors. Hayes sat heavily on a bench, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off the cold. Another soldier leaned against the wall with his eyes closed. Even Ortiz looked worn, the lines in his face deeper than they had been an hour earlier. I stood near the doorway, still half expecting the dust to move under my boots or the lights to flicker into that slow rhythm we had grown used to. Medical arrived in a few minutes. They checked Hayes first. His heartbeat was slow, almost half-pace, then returned to normal without warning. They touched his arm and winced at how cold his skin felt under the uniform. He kept telling them he was fine, but his eyes stayed fixed on the doorway behind us as if something might slip through at any moment. When they examined me, they found nothing wrong except an elevated pulse and slight tremors. I did not explain where the tremors came from. I knew they did not belong to fear alone. A senior officer arrived next. He asked for our report in short, clipped questions. Ortiz answered everyone with steady detail but avoided describing the shifting walls or the movement in the dust. He spoke only of sensor failures, missing personnel, and possible structural hazards. The officer took notes without looking surprised, as if he had expected something outside routine before he even entered the room. When he finished, he collected our recorders and told us to rest until he returned. None of us believed we would see those recorders again. The officer left with the folder, our logs, and our equipment. The guard at the door watched him go and then looked at us with a quiet understanding. He did not ask what really happened. He did not want to know. There are places on any post where questions only make a man unsettled, and the lower vault wing had always been one of them. When we were finally allowed to return to our barracks, the sun had begun to rise. A thin line of gold crept across the sky, bright and clean, nothing like the dim light underground. I walked slowly, feeling each step on solid ground. Every hallway looked normal, every door stood where it belonged, and the air moved with a natural warmth that felt almost strange after the cold drifting through the vault corridors. People passed us on their way to morning duties. They nodded, unaware of where we had been or what we had seen. I tried to sleep for a few hours but woke after only a short rest. In the quiet room, I watched sunlight settle on my locker door. The light did not bend. It did not flicker. It stayed exactly where it should. Yet my mind kept drifting back to the dust that shifted on its own and the faint tone that pulsed behind the walls. I wondered if the missing soldier had tried to call out when the halls changed around him, or if he had followed a path the wing shaped for him alone. Later that day, Command issued a brief notice. The lower vault wing was sealed until further review. Maintenance would inspect structural concerns. Sensor failures would remain under investigation. No mention of our teammate, no mention of the shifting corridors or the strange cold that moved like flowing breath. No mention of the seamless doors that opened without sound. By nightfall, the metallic taste finally began to fade, though it never left entirely. I sat on the edge of my bunk with the folder of blank replacement log sheets beside me. They felt heavier than paper should. When Ortiz passed by, he paused at my doorway. He looked at me for a long moment and said only that some findings never reached the reports. Then he walked away. I lay back on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to hold on to the sense of normal ground beneath me. The halls above might stay still for now, but something deeper in the wing remained awake, and I knew it had watched us leave. The days that followed moved quietly, almost too quietly for a place as busy as the post. Our team was pulled from regular duty and placed on light tasks with no explanation. No one said it aloud, but each of us knew why. Command wanted distance between us and whatever waited below the sealed wing. When I passed the old stairwell during a supply run, 2 guards stood there with fresh locks on the door and a new warning sign bolted above it. The air around that entry felt normal, yet I caught a faint cold patch at my wrist as I walked by, thin enough to doubt, sharp enough to remember. A week later, Ortiz called us into a small briefing room. He said the search for our missing teammate had ended. The file carried the word disappearance. No cause listed, no final trace. Only a short statement saying the wing would stay closed until further notice. After the briefing, everyone walked out in silence. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the blank wall where sunlight reflected in a clean, steady line. It did not bend the way our lamps had underground. That night, I packed my gear slowly. Each piece felt heavier than it should, as if the coal from the deeper halls still clung to the fabric. When I lay down, the room settled into its usual stillness, yet I kept waiting for the low tone to rise from the walls. It never came. Only the memory of it stayed, moving through my thoughts in slow, steady pulses. By morning, life on the post looked normal again. But as I stepped outside, I tasted a thin hint of metal on the air. It lasted only a moment before fading. It was enough to remind me that the wing had let us leave. Not that it had forgotten us. Years passed before I could talk about that mission without feeling the air tighten around my chest. Time usually softens things, but the memory of those shifting halls stayed sharp, like a cold edge pressed gently against the mind. I served in other places after Fort Knox, some difficult and some calm, yet nothing ever carried the same weight as that unfinished vault buried under the post. What troubles me most is not what we saw, but what we did not understand. The dust that moved on its own, the walls that changed shape, the voices returned from places we had never entered. These moments did not fade with distance. They settled deeper, becoming clearer the longer I carried them. I sometimes wonder if the wing was built over something older, something the structure tried to hold but never fully contained. No one told us, and maybe no one knew. When I think of our missing teammate, I do not imagine him lost in a simple corridor. I picture him standing in a place where time bends differently, where footsteps do not follow the ground, and where the faint low tone guides people the same way it guided us. I hope he found a path out. I hope the halls gave him a way back, though the silence of the reports tells me otherwise. Even now, metal carries a taste I cannot forget. Cold patches on winter mornings make me pause. Sometimes, when the house settles at night, I hear soft shifts that remind me of the dust arcs forming under our lamps. They never last long, but they come often enough for me to know that part of the wing stayed with me. I am older now, and I understand that not all findings reach the record books. Some stay buried because they belong to places that do not sit still. If I ever return to Fort Knox, I doubt I will walk near that sealed stairwell. Some structures feel awake, and once they notice you, the memory never quite lets go. That wing under the vault watched us leave. I still feel that. And on quiet nights, when the world seems steady, I think about how close we came to learning what waited behind those seamless doors.